your customer is everybody or nobody, and that's like
Yeah.
kind of a terrible place to be in. Like talk
Yeah.
about who your ideal customer profile is. But
Yep.
have you figured it
Absolutely.
out?
Absolutely. Is this an investor asking? 100%. No, it's like it's always going to be a work in progress. I will say that like I do think for years it felt like we had the same problems every year, and everything was always getting a bit better at this slow but steady pace, but it was so challenging trying to draw a straight line from anything we did and built to anything that happened. It was like pushing on wet noodles. It's just like, well, something we're doing is working, but what?
And we're back for another episode of the Startup Hustle. Today, very excited to be joined by Charity Majors, who's the co-founder and CTO of Honeycomb. Today, we're going to talk about her company and her journey. They do observability. I think Charity would say they were the first ones to do observability. Maybe that'll be my first question for her today. Before we get started, I do want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by Fullscale. If you need help hiring software developers, you can check us out at fullscale.io. That's what my company does. So I guess for my first question for you, what is observability, and did you guys invent observability?
That's such a great question. We started Honeycomb in 2016, and we had to start by writing a storage engine and like some pretty challenging technical problems. But I would actually say that the hardest problem we had was trying to figure out how to talk about what we were building. Because we were so clear that it wasn't monitoring, that it was, a fairly different and new paradigm. Every term in data is so overloaded. Analytics and, anomaly detection, and just like it's all being used. And it was like midway through the first year that I Googled the term observability, and you're right, it wasn't widely in use in the industry at that point. But when I read the definition off Wikipedia, which is all about, can you understand the inner workings of a system just by observing its outputs? I just had like one of those like light bulb moments, just like, oh my God, this is what we're trying to build. And we spent a couple years hammering out, I would say, a pretty long laundry list of, in order to have observability, you need to have high cardinality, high dimensionality, explorability, like all these things. And around 2019, 2020, I did a lot of like correcting people on Twitter, which is a great way to make friends. Like, that's not really observability. This is really observability. I
Yeah.
started to get like a lot of industry notice in around 2019, 2020, and a lot of people started picking it up and going, we do observability too. And I got pretty angsty about it for a while. But eventually, like, I came around to the idea that the real definition of observability is it's a property of complex systems, just like performance or scalability or reliability. I like putting the emphasis on the systems rather than the tools. Like the laundry list of tools is never good, but like if you do accept like that really big tent definition where you add some metrics, you improve your observability, you share tips with your teammates, you improve your observability. I think it does fail to account for what I think is a pretty step function that people are observing. Let's call it the 1.0 generation of observability tools and the 2.0 generation. And I've sort of begrudgingly
Well,
coming
to
around to being like, to like the idea that we need to version it, because according to semantic versioning, you bump major versions when it's backwards incompatible, breaking releases. And I think that the observability 1.0 version is your three pillars world, right? You've got metrics, logs, and traces. You've got APM, you've got RUM, you've got blah, blah, blah. And what connects all of them? Nothing. Nothing except the engineer who's sitting in the middle going, copy pasting IDs
so
around. Yeah.
So I think to step back for a second, though, for those who are listening to this, so the primary use case for all of this is collecting analytical data, basically about software, how the software is running, what the software does, how it's performing. And so I had a previous company called Stackify that did some of these similar things, never to the detailed level that you guys do at observability level. We were a little higher, but when you created the term, we, of course, oh yeah, we also do it, and then you probably made fun of me on Twitter. The best way I could always describe it is like we're sort of like the black box on an airplane. It's like we collect all this information and then figure out, okay, what do we do with this information? Is that a good way to describe it for the person that's listening today?
Yeah, sure, totally. I do think like one of the big shifts from the 1.0 land to like a 2.0 land is that in the past, like observability tooling has been very much about operating your software. It's about MTTR and MTTD and reliability and uptime and SLOs and everything. And I think that like the world that we're sort of emerging into is one where you don't separate systems and application data from business data, but you unify them, right? Because all of the
Right.
interesting questions that you need to ask about your systems contain all three, right? Like I remember an early user at Honeycomb, Intercom, was on the verge of doing this. They had outgrown the largest EC2 instance size for their database. And so they were like, shit, we're going to have to shard it. We're going to like do this year-long project. And they instrumented with Honeycomb and they instrumented app IDs and everything. And they were just poking around and pretty quickly realized that 75% of their execution time was being eaten up by a single app ID who was paying them $20 a month. And they were like, what if we just throttle this guy?
Wow.
And it's like
Right.
all of the interesting
So I think
questions
that
are a
highlights
combination.
highlights a good example of why people use this. I think for people who are listening that aren't familiar with this, like that, I think that's a great use case where you're trying to find, hey, if you have one user that is using a lot of resource, or trying to find weird use cases of things, or all these like weird scenarios. One of the things I talk about with people sometimes is people build software that provides a lot of insights, like provides a lot of dashboards, and it kind of tells you what you need to know. And there's some tools that like give you all the data and then you ask all the questions. And I would say your software is a little more on that side, right? Like you guys have all the data and then you let people ask whatever question they want to ask of the data. Would you guys put yourself on that side?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that our system used to fail in predictable ways, and they don't anymore. And when it comes to understanding your software, like you can't define in advance, I'm just going to need these dashboards. I'm just going to need to answer these questions because all of the interesting things that happen are novel.
Yeah. So I asked, so along these lines, I asked Martin, who works for you, what should I ask you today? And he said, like, do you want something that gets her going? And he asked something I'm sure that you probably don't agree with, is like, AI is not magically going to find and fix these problems, right? Like we are forever going to have these kinds of problems,
Yeah.
and AI is not going to solve them.
At the end of the day, people have to understand their systems. So there are two kinds of tools. There are tools that abstract away complexity and tools that help you understand it. Right now, there's a lot of
Right.
abstracting away. Honestly, when it comes to developer tools, right now, someone I work with is like, generative AI tools for developers are like having a really excitable junior engineer on your team who types really fast. Like it's really good at generating lots of code. But like that has never been the hard part of software engineering, and it never will be. Like it's getting easier and easier to write code, but like the hard part of software has always been maintaining, extending, refining, making it tractable for teams of people to understand over the long term, understanding the cost of goods sold, understand scaling, all of these problems happen after the code has been written. And I don't see AI making a dent in most of them at this point. There's also the question of whether or not AI will ever be good at solving very deterministic problems. Obviously, non-deterministic problems, it's amazing. Like do all the things with generative AI if it's like non-deterministic and so like I think pointing generative AI at like analyzing the human behavior of humans interacting with systems can help us bring everyone up to the level of the best debugger in every corner of the system. But when it comes to like actually pinpointing exactly what happened after you changed a couple lines of software, that's not an AI problem. That's just a straight up computing problem.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like the hardest part about software is debating like what we're going to do, why we're going to do it, why are we building this thing, why we're not doing it this way, like all the requirements, the planning, getting people to agree, telling people that's a stupid idea, we're not going to do that. Like all of that part of it is the complexity part, and then you go write the code, and the code could be the easy part.
Yep, 100%.
So one thing that's really interesting, I'd love to go back and so you said you started on this idea in 2016. Is that when the company started, or the company didn't start until a couple of years later?
Company started in 2016. We were very small
Okay.
for a very long time, and in retrospect, what we were doing was category creation. At the time, we were just like fumbling along and almost failing every single year. But like for the first, 5 years, we had like 12 people, like maybe had 30 people, but like we were very small. It didn't really start to pick up speed until, and this is, I guess, somewhat normal for infrastructure. Infrastructure startups they take longer to get off the ground, I think, than a lot of other
Yeah.
startups, because there's a lot more engineering to do under the hood, and it takes longer to bake. It also takes a while for people's minds to change. Like, I felt like a big part of the work was, putting the stuff out there and then waiting for people to kind of wrap their heads around it and integrate it into their worldview. And you just can't rush some of that stuff.
Well, so it's very difficult to create a category, and I feel like you and I were in a little bit of the same boat on this with Stackify, where we were trying to build similar sort of tools to Honeycomb in a different way. We were focused more on logs and APM and metrics. In your early days, you were focused probably more on the transaction tracing or whatever, maybe. But we were trying to, my point was, like, we were actually trying to sell to developers, which felt like really hard. Like, most developers didn't know what to do with these tools. Developers thought more about things like logs, like, show me my logs. That's how they thought about things. Like, I want to look at my logging data. Like, using APM and the more advanced functionality that you guys provide now was more foreign to them, right? Like, it was not something that they didn't think that way.
Also, developer teams have not historically had budgets. All of this stuff has historically been run out of ops teams. And I do feel like, sort of the vanguard, the cutting edge of SRE and ops teams were, starting to drag developers into this. But it's really, there's so many like fast moving currents in software. And one of the big ones is, like when we started in 2016, the idea of putting software engineers on call was controversial. Like, when I would talk about this on Twitter, I get like a lot of very angry people. Like, I didn't become a software engineer to get woken up in the middle of the night. And it's like, but like,
that's
at the heart,
always been part of the job, though.
always been part of the job.
To me.
And at the heart of every like engineering team is feedback loops. And one of the biggest, most powerful feedback loops is just the act of writing software, getting it out in front of users, seeing whether it works or not, and making that feedback loop, tight and instrumented and observable. Is like, I feel like there's so much just like dark matter in software engineering, where it's like, why are we moving so slowly? Why does it take this long? And it's not obvious, and it's hard to see because you can't see it, right? And it's not until like you've kind of like seen it from the other side that you're like, it was so slow because. I think a lot of that boils down to the inadequacy of people's observability. Without observability, you can't move fast and you can't move with confidence. And with software, there's this great quote that I heard, and I don't remember where because I'd like to credit them, but it was like, you can either have better software faster or worse software slower. In software, speed is safety. It's more like as human beings, when we get scared and anxious, we freeze, right? Like, we want to slow down, get control, and it doesn't work that way in software. It's more like ice skating. You slow down, you fall over. And so, like, sort of making that mental shift and embracing the fact that if it hurts, you have to do it more is, I think, really key to building great software teams.
So going back to having to create kind of a new market, tell me about the challenges of that. Like, from my experience, I know like selling to developers is really hard. You mentioned before, like, they don't have a budget, was traditionally sold to ops teams. So for like your guys' product, are you selling to developers or selling to ops or both? What is that like for you?
Yes. I mean, one of the challenging parts at Honeycomb has always been the difficulty, the impossibility of boiling down our ideal customer profile to like a single role,
Right.
or, because we're so small compared to our competitors that we can't outmarket them. We have to rely on having champions inside these organizations. And our champions are software engineers, architects, SREs, ops, VPs, principal engineers, staff engineers, directors.
It's everyone.
Like, they're all over the freaking map. And it's really hard to just be like, this works. Now go out and pattern match and do it again.
Yeah. Well, that was the same problem we had at Stackify. So our customers are really small. So our average customer paid like $3,000 or $4,000 a year. I'm sure yours are way bigger. But we had customers in 60 countries too. So I had customers in 60 countries.
Oh, yeah. Same.
All the same, all the job titles, all the things. So it's like your customer is everybody or nobody. And that's like kind of a terrible place to be in. Like, talk about who your ideal customer profile is. But have you figured it out?
Absolutely. Is this an investor asking? 100%. No, it's always going to be a work in progress. I will say that, like, I do think for years it felt like we had the same problems every year. And everything was always getting a bit better at this slow but steady pace. But it was so challenging trying to draw a straight line from anything we did and built to anything that happened. It was like pushing on wet noodles. It's just like, well, something we're doing is working, but what?
So tell me about who you guys compete with. I mean, you guys obviously compete with New Relic and Datadog and App Dynamics and all these different people. How do you separate yourself in the market? And you, as you said, like you're the little guy compared to some of these monsters. Tell me about competing in that space.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, like Datadog is obviously the whale, right? Like that everyone's competing against. And I would say that our strength, our superpower, the thing that makes us different than every other company out there is sort of the observability 2.0 concept. It's the idea that instead of having many pillars, many different tools, many sources of truth, you have a single source of truth. And from the wide structured events, you can derive metrics, you can derive logs, you can derive traces, you can derive SLOs, and it's all knitted together. So you can zoom in and zoom out and slice and dice and explore. And that is something that is challenging to express in something really pithy. And it's also challenging to explain to people just like how many socio-technical consequences of that proceed from it. But it is incredibly powerful. Like to this day, it's like if we get into a POC with a company, like we win like just like an overwhelming percent of them. But the challenge is getting people to understand why it's worth giving it a shot, you know?
Well, so tell me, I interview people a lot about what it's like to be a CTO and the difference of being a CTO. And I guess that is one of the problems, and most people don't figure this out, I think, until they're a business owner and realizing like the hardest part about business is sales, right? It's sales and marketing. It's a challenge you have. It's like, how do people understand why we're different? How do we get in front of them? How do they know why Honeycomb? And your background is all in engineering, right? So, I mean, this is probably a lot of learnings for you of like, all of this is like a huge challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Although from the very beginning, Christine and I knew we were setting out to build a business, not just a product, not just, and like my experience at Parse a decade ago was, so formative for me. I loved Parse. Parse was a mobile backend as a service. It was like Heroku for mobile. I loved it. People loved the product. Like to this day, people will be like, oh my God, you worked on Parse. But the founders never built a business. And so we got sold off for parts, at the like,
Yeah.
when we were very small. And it was very clear to me in retrospect just how little energy they really put into like building the business side. And so we've tried to signal from the very beginning just that we know what we don't know and that we need really good business people. This has served us really well because honestly, great sales, marketing, customer success, docs, people in the industry are not used to being treated especially well by engineers, especially not engineers who are founders. They're really used to being taken for granted, being dismissed. There's this perception in Silicon Valley that if you're an engineer, you can do anyone's job. And if you're not an engineer, like you're like a lower tier of human being. And it's so poisonous and it's so destructive. And I think it's a big part of why so many engineer founded companies lose control over their own destiny. So yeah, it has been a huge learning journey for us. Also in the early days, I felt like it was enough for us to respect it, that we didn't have to learn it ourselves, that we could sort of outsource the expertise of sales and marketing to other people. And that was a long and painful lesson to learn, that you cannot outsource those core functions. I mean, obviously you have to have leaders who can lead it and who you trust, but you have to understand it, understand their jobs, understand what they're doing and why, help to set the strategy. And before you can hire those great leaders, you have to understand it by doing the job yourself, or you're not going to hire great leaders, because great leaders don't want to come work for founders who don't understand what makes them great.
I'm so glad that you said that, because as founders, I wrote in my newsletter, and by the way, you can check out the newsletter at startuphustle.xyz and sign up. Was about how the founder's first job is sales. Like it's always the founder's first job. One question I have for you though is, so when you guys started this company, you were the CEO, and then you switched. You and your co-founder swapped. So tell me more about that. You started as CTO. Was she was the CTO?
Sorta, yeah. Well, like honestly, in the beginning we had 3 co-founders, but pretty early on we had to which is why it was such like I had never planned on being CEO. Like I would have declined the plan, but it was kind of like, oof, somebody's got to do it, and I was not good at this. Like, you really do want somebody who's a pretty structured human being to be your CEO. And I am not a structured human being, and I have no interest in becoming one. So I was CEO for the first 3.5, 4 years, basically about until we found product market fit. And then Christine and I swapped places. She is so much more powerful as a CEO than I was, but I think that my comfort with chaos is pretty key early on. And then once we needed to become much more structured, like, she was just so much better at it. Christine and I are opposites in like every way, like every personality test or like business horoscope that we've ever done, it's like we are on opposite poles of every single thing. And as a relationship, I have worked harder on my relationship with Christine than I have worked on my marriage, than I've worked on anything else. But it is paid off. Like, she is so phenomenal, and the two of us together have learned to be pretty effective, I think.
So you talked earlier about outsourcing sales. So when you said that, did you mean like hiring somebody, or you guys in the early days actually hired like outside firms to try and help do that for you?
I did not mean outsourcing. I just meant like expecting someone else to run it and do it for you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's really hard, and I think you do a great job on Twitter, and I'm not sure what other mediums you use, but you do a certain amount of thought leadership and social and stuff like that. And does that drive a lot of business for you guys as well?
Overwhelmingly. Like, to this day, I don't know that we've ever landed a customer who hasn't like followed me and Liz Fung Jones on Twitter, which is a little bit of a problem in and of itself. But we did all of this. I felt like we were showing our work. We were figuring it out and talking about it as we were figuring it out, because there wasn't really a template. We knew we were trying to do something kind of radically new, and so talking about it openly and like seeing what people would really respond to and key off of was really instrumental for us in developing the product and the voice.
Well, it's also a case study for using Twitter for marketing.
It really is. And what's so funny is how unconscious all of it was. Like, people are, in retrospect, everything looks so like well done, and well, that was strategically important, and we were really just like winging it the entire time, and we got very fortunate.
Well, you were being very transparent, right? I've followed you off and on Twitter for, I think, pretty much all of these years. My use of Twitter has went up and down over these years. You've always been very transparent, and I would, had a strong opinion about a lot of these different things. And there are a certain amount of people that like that and are going to be drawn to that, somebody actually having an opinion, which has served you really, really well.
I think so. It is not for everyone, and that's fine. That's fine. I try to talk to people the way I want to be talked to, and something that one of our company values is we hire adults. And I think that companies can be infantilizing in a lot of ways without really meaning to, but they just don't trust that their people can handle the truth. And I really resent being treated that way. And so, like, I never want to treat other people that way. Like, I think people have an enormous capacity to understand why decisions were made, even if they don't agree with them. And I feel like if they're devoted, you can only really work for one company at a time. And I feel sort of a responsibility. If someone is spending their life working on a company that I am partly responsible for, they deserve to know what's happening, and this is something where finding the right level of transparency has been a work in progress, because in the beginning, it's not about transparency so much. It's just like, people don't need to hear every single play-by-play. It's actually really distracting. People feel a little jerked around. It's like, oh, we had a really bad pitch to a VC today. Like, they don't actually need to hear that. But I do believe that if they want to know, they have a right to that information. But it's my job, like, as a leader, to figure out how to give them enough information that they are informed, that they can do a good job, that they can think about how their work rolls up to everything else, and without like distracting them or like dragging them down into the minutia of what's my job to take care of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've done an incredible job of all of that on Twitter, but I'm curious, why don't you do the post the same kind of content on LinkedIn?
Honestly, it's a bandwidth thing. Like, I'm very much of a dilettante when it comes to all social media these days. I'll go for a month or two without touching any of them, and then I catch up on everything.
Okay.
And then I just can't keep up. I would love to post everything to like fucking Mastodon and Blue Sky or whatever it is too. But I'll
Yeah.
only have so much bandwidth.
Yeah, I get that too. And Twitter's the one I don't post on. So I always post on LinkedIn. So
Ah,
I'm the opposite from that perspective.
yeah.
So tell us a little more about what I love is we're talking about how I wouldn't say all of your business, but say a good percentage of your business has come from this thought leadership and stuff on Twitter, which is phenomenal. But tell us you've also raised a lot of money. Like, this is a big company. You have over 200 employees, right? Like, tell us a little more about that journey of the size and scale. I mean, you guys must have a lot of other sales channels and stuff that work as well.
The growth, we doubled our size in 2020, and then we had a little bit of a break, and we doubled again in 2022. And it's been really interesting. Like, I'm not really sure exactly what you want me to speak to, but it's something that, are you familiar with, what's his face? Pat Lencioni, the books that he writes about, like, he famously wrote the one about the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and he's written some other great work on, like, my favorite book of his is the one called The Advantage, where he talks about how it is such an advantage to have a well-run business. I wrote a blog post sort of about this too. You're probably familiar with Dan McKinley's famous blog post of Choose Boring Software. I wrote a blog post called Choose Boring
Yeah.
Culture, because I feel like so often companies put all this energy into trying to be the fun, hip company, and that's not what people need from their workplaces. They need workplaces that are well-run, well operated, where lines of communication are clear, where people have psychological safety to speak up, where people have agency, where people have autonomy, where people can like make an impact, where there are clear goals, where people have the support that they need. All of this stuff sounds hella boring because it sounds easy and it's incredibly difficult. And I really think that there's such a competitive advantage available to companies that can just figure out how to run a boring company. Because if you run a boring company, that means that people's minds and emotions are not bound up in drama and day to day and like, oh, what's going to happen to me. They can devote it to their work and to collaborate and to figuring out, like, there's so much creative capacity at every company. If people care and are emotionally engaged in their work, they're best positioned to spot, anomalies and threats and opportunities. And most companies make use of, like, such a tiny fraction of the overall collective creativity of their organization. And, like, you don't need to make a fun company because people are fun. If you build a nice boring company, people will bring the fun. They will bring the character and the creativity and
Yeah.
the jokes and everything. It's so much more important as leadership that you create a company that, like, is functional.
I totally agree. That makes absolutely sense. One of the things you mentioned to me before is one of your guys' focus is now going up market. How is that going for you guys?
So a big part of this has been trying to we've historically spoken to developers and engineers really well, and we're needing to refine our voice to figure out how to speak to technical decision makers now in the same way, which means talking and being a lot more clear on, like, what are the business implications? What are the business challenges? What are the commonalities and business challenges that a lot of our prospects are facing? And which ones really align with, like, so for example, we have figured out that really good customers for us are ones where you can align individual like with dollars. So, like, delivery companies, you need to understand every single transaction versus, say, advertising, where it's just kind of spray and pray. Nobody actually cares if an individual ad got delivered to an individual person.
Yeah.
That's really important for us. It's also really important that the teams that we are really successful with are ones that are not so down in the trenches firefighting and just like that they can't plan. We're really successful at this point, at this stage in the company's development, with teams that are able to plan for the next year or 2 or 3, and they're trying to make technical choices that will grow with them, which is why, platform engineering is a pretty new thing, hasn't really gotten defined down to just like generic, people who are building platform engineering teams are pretty intentional and mindful at this point. And so, those are really great teams for us because they're forward looking. They have a bit of extra, time and energy to focus on making good investments instead of just being in reaction mode all the time. So those are a couple of the things we really look for.
Awesome. Well, what else is the future of Honeycomb? How is your guys' product set, feature set change? Like, what is the future for you guys?
So we just released a couple things that I think are really interesting. We just released our very first foray into front-end observability, which is,
Okay.
RUM should not be yet another standalone tool. It should be just, the same event so that you can trace from mobile devices and from, web browsers all the way to storage and back and forth. So we're going to be building on that. And we also shipped this relational traces thing, which is pretty great because right now most tools, all they have are aggregates and exemplars. So you can define these really high level aggregates, and then you can get a sort of random example. And if it's not the right example, you hit reload. And if it's not the one, you hit reload again. It's really blunt, right? And instead being able to like slice and dice and inspect into traces and look for commonalities and patterns and so forth is one of those like superpowers that our storage engine will allow you to do. We're also, I think, we've built some stuff with Query Assistant that dips a toe into LLMs using AI to help understand, which basically is just like you can use natural language to be like, what are my slowest endpoints, which is really helpful. But when
Yeah.
it comes to the future, like I think that we have the architecture, the bones to be one of the best tools for developing LLMs, period, because it can't deal with aggregates. When you're building with LLMs, you really need wide raw events and the ability to like do aggregation at read time instead of write time.
Yeah, I worked on, you mentioned real user monitoring and all these things. It's interesting because I worked on all these sort of similar sort of things that you guys work on. I have a lot of experience with all of it, and all of it led to just an enormous amount of data. And you
Yeah,
guys more than anything, right, are a data company and had to build your own storage, and you built your own storage engine. You still use that today?
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. It's
What is that like?
it was one of those examples where we were too dumb to know better and it turned out to be an asset. But like in the beginning, we knew that we needed a columnar store. We knew that part of observability as we define it is the ability to ask any question without having to predefine schemas or indexes or any of that stuff. And there was nothing out there, so we started building our own. And now this lost us our first couple of investors. They were like, well, that was stupid. You should have found product market fit and then built a storage engine. And I was just like, but that it wouldn't have made any sense because then we would have looked and felt just like everyone else and there wouldn't have been a product market fit to find. But like really, they were right when it comes to traditional investing advice, and we were wrong. But I'm so glad that we did because it's such a competitive advantage for us today. And it is, I think, the reason that although I think that there's pretty broad acceptance now that like what we've carved out as observability is the future. It's how people have to understand their increasingly complex systems. But you can't just retrofit that onto a time series store or a traditional metrics database or traditional logging store. It's quite a moat, actually. And it's one that will continue to pay off for us because there are so many cool features, like power user features that we can build that we just aren't building right now because that's not what's holding us back as a business. It's the broad adoption stuff. But I think it's going to be a huge competitive advantage for us for years to come.
I mean, have you ever thought about taking the storage engine itself and turning that into its own business? And
We thought about it a bit. We've also thought about open sourcing it, but it's non-trivial to operate, and I'm not sure how we would justify that from a financial perspective. And honestly, it's a data store that is optimized for observability. Like, I don't think you would want to run it for any other use cases because it's probably the only database out there that values fast and close to write over correct. So in a sense, we are
okay,
monetizing it as a storage backend. It's just that, and it also leads to, so I think one of the really big differences between observability 1.0 and 2.0 is the class structure. Because when you're in a 1.0 land, you're paying for every request that enters your system, you pay to store it 5, 6, 7 different tools, which means that the cost profile is just insanely expensive. And even more so because time series databases don't store any relational data. So you have to define upfront in advance every single combination of things that you want to store and be able to query someday, which is incredibly costly. I published a white paper last week where I walked you through. So like if you want to capture a heat map for request.latency, it costs you like $63,000 a month because it's just not metrics are a powerful tool for summarizing vast quantities of data. It's not the right tool for the job for introspecting or understanding complex systems. And so I think that like good observability is never going to be cheap, but the cost should be predictable. They should be pegged. They should grow like linearly
Yeah.
with your like traffic and your tool. And it shouldn't just bite you in the ass from out of nowhere. One of the other problems with metrics is that it can change out from under you, and suddenly you have a high cardinality problem. Suddenly your build doubles, but the value you got out of it didn't go up. It may have even gone down. So like
Yeah.
it's just like so disconnected from the value that it's just like it's one of those telltale signs and data when you've got the wrong data model for the job. It's just costs are just out of control and unpredictable.
And that's one of the problems of using the cloud in general. Like everybody makes this mistake of like for us, we were troubleshooting in Kubernetes. We were using Azure Kubernetes and turned on some logging or whatever, right? And then like forget to turn it off, and it's like,
Yeah,
that costs $10,000. Like
yeah,
that
yeah.
problem
Oopsie.
happens all the time when you're operating at larger scale.
Yeah,
It's a
100%.
serious problem. There's just so much data.
Yep.
Well, I've really loved having you on the show today. It's fantastic. Again, this is Charity Majors, CTO, formerly CEO, and co-founder of Honeycomb. You can check them out at honeycomb.io. If you build complicated software and you need help troubleshooting it, Charity's company is the company to check out. It's not the needle in the haystack; it's the needle in the needle stack, really, right, for you guys.
Exactly. Well put.
It's helping solve complex problems for developers, and I can appreciate. So, thank you so much for being on the show today. This was fantastic.
Thanks for having me. This was really fun.
Thank you.